Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and today we continue our journey into the Halo mythos. Initiated from a citadel on the Lesser Ark far outside the galaxy, the activation of Halo proved both the value and the horror of the Master Builder's weapons. Although the Flood had been brought to an end for a time, responsibility for the array now passed from Bornstellar and the Foreigners to the installation's individual monitors, such as Alpha Halo's 343 Guilty Spark. They alone carried the burden of safeguarding the rings across the long expanse of time that would follow. Many millennia after the array's activation, the crashed Foreigner keyship, eventually known as the Dreadnought, became an object of worship for the Sanshayum on Janjur-Kum. Their reverence for the ancient machine would split the Sanshayum people, as they differed greatly on how it should be worshipped, a tension that would eventually ignite into full-scale war. This violence would lead to the creation of the Covenant, carrying destruction into the centuries to come. Nearly 100,000 years after the activation of Halo, the Sanshayum species, receded by the librarian's conservation measure, began to explore the many Foreigner relics that remained on their planet. Ignorant of the events which had unfolded in their ancient past, the Sanshayum developed their own religious beliefs around these awe-inspiring artifacts. Their core convictions revolved around the notion that the Foreigners had purposefully left these artifacts behind to guide those that came after them to divine transcendence, something they referred to as the Great Journey. The most remarkable of these precious artifacts was a Foreigner keyship, the Dreadnought, partially submerged in the Great Apophthia, an immense sea in Janjur-Kum's northern hemisphere. Many Sanshayum believed that they should access its inner systems for exploration, but this idea was met with fierce opposition. The most devout of their kind believed that tampering with such artifacts was an act of heresy. Controversy erupted and a split quickly formed between the two major ideologies. The Stoics, who believed that artifacts should only be worshipped at a distance, and the less numerous Reformists, who argued that these artifacts were gifts to be explored, activated, and even dismantled if practical benefits could come from it. In 2200 BCE, this tension devolved into a violent civil conflict the Sanshayum would refer to as the War of Wills. A bloody, century-long feud that culminated in 1,000 heavily armed Reformists secretly infiltrating the Dreadnought and barricading themselves inside. After 40 days inside, the Reformists managed to activate the vessel's systems and succeeded in igniting its ancient engines. Rising up from the sea and into Janjur-Kum's sky, the Reformists had finally escaped their planet, leaving those who remained behind in sorrowful bewilderment. For hundreds of years, these Sanshayum would use the Dreadnought to move from one system to another, finding numerous reliquary sites replete with artifacts and technologies left behind by their gods. Their philosophy grew around the Great Journey and vague prophecies of the sacred rings, generating the framework for a profound religious system, one which would drive all of their efforts in the future. For a time, their progress would continue unimpeded until they came in contact with a powerful warrior species that would not simply hand over the relics they sought. The start of a conflict even greater than the first. In 938 BCE, the Sanshayum came upon Olgithon, a rocky world that initially appeared to be uninhabited. The first pioneer detachments set their sights on an enormous mountain range that the Dreadnought's luminary, a Foreigner machine that could track ancient artifacts, had targeted as a repository for hidden relics. They discovered that the mountains were inhabited by a saurian species known as the Sangheli. Their first encounter seemed positive, though tense, But as soon as the Sangheili discovered the Sanshayum's true intentions for the artifacts on their world, a bitter, devastating war broke out that would bring both species to their very knees. Both the Sanshayum and the Sangheili had evolved on worlds rich with foreigner artifacts, and both regarded them as holy, developing deeply religious beliefs about the architects of these machines. The Sangheili culture had a rigid, feudal structure with a heavy disposition towards combat, and became more focused on discovery and protection of the foreigner artifacts with each passing generation. Much like the Sanshayum Stoics, they believed that the physical manipulation of such technology was sacrilegious to the highest degree and punishable by death. When the Sangheili learned that the Sanshayum intended to excavate and retrieve the sacred artifacts for themselves, as they evidently had with their Dreadnought, they turned against the invaders. The conflict over Olgathon lasted a full year. By the end, there was little left of the world but a charred husk filled with dead warriors and shattered ships. The desecration of Olgathon was only the start of the War of Beginnings, a conflict between these two species that would last decades. As time passed, the Sangheili realised that they lacked enough firepower to halt the Dreadnought's violent incursions. When they finally agreed to use foreigner technology to defend their worlds, their now augmented defences sent the war into stalemate. In 852 BCE, a tentative truce was brokered between a Sangheili leader named Pelasar the Strident and a Sanshayum known as Breaking Shadow. The two leaders forgave the past crimes of their species and began working towards a peaceful alliance. This was eventually established by the Writ of Union, an agreement founded on the belief that despite their blood-soaked history, both species could work toward the same goal. The Covenant was born. The focal point of the Covenant was the legend of Halo, the sacred rings which they believed held the ability to translate their physical bodies into divinity, just as it had done with the Foreigners. This tragically mistaken interpretation governed all future actions of the Covenant, including their vicious genocidal war against humankind in the centuries that followed. The desecration of Olgathon and the War of Beginnings that raged in the decades that followed proved the Sanshayum that, despite their powerful foreigner Dreadnought, they would be wise to form an alliance with a species as strong and relentless as the Sangheili. During their first battle, the Sangheili courageously faced off against the ominous foreigner Dreadnought from warrens and ridges across the face of Olgathon, using the most formidable weapons of war they could then fashion. In the years that followed the war, all Sangheili weapons and ships would be upgraded with foreigner technology and ornately styled by the Sanshayum to befit their newly founded covenant. The Writ of Union between the two founding species of the Covenant was not a simple coalition, but rather a contract of requirements and responsibilities for both the Sanshayum and the Sangheili. In addition to both species laying down their arms, they commissioned the construction of a shared homeworld, the Holy City of High Charity. From this massive fortress, the Covenant subdued and integrated a new species into their alliance. Together, they moved ever forward in their quest for foreigner technology and ultimately the activation of the sacred rings. As part of the writ, the Sanshayum agreed to forsake their Dreadnought, decommissioning it permanently. It would eventually be used as the primary source of power for the Covenant Holy City of High Charity, a mobile homeworld for the Alliance. The Sanshayum would also adopt the Sangheili language as their own in response to the sheer number of Sangheili in the Covenant. This was viewed by the Sangheili as the greatest single concession the Sanshayum made, effectively establishing their own culture as the primary foundation for the Covenant. To the Sanshayum, this was a non-issue. They had few surviving cultural practices of interest. They could easily trade their language for power. They established a triumvirate of ruling hierarchs at the head of the Covenant, This formalised the convention that the Sanshayum, commonly referred to as prophets, were responsible for governance, religion, and science, whereas the Sanghili, known as the elites, would retain the role of military protection, exploration, and the recovery of foreigner artifacts. Thus began a long relationship born of skepticism and distrust, but now unified under the mutual belief in the Great Journey and the godhood promised by the sacred rings. After the Dreadnought had been decommissioned, it was nestled in the slowly constructed shell of High Charity, itself built on materials recovered from the Sanshayum homeworld. As well as providing seemingly unlimited power and energy, the Dreadnought's relic-detecting luminary was duplicated and equipped on a number of key Sanghili ships, leading their fleets throughout space to one foreigner site after another. Another foreigner technology employed by the Covenant was the Engineers, or Hurugok as they were originally called by their creators. They were machines made to look like living creatures, a composite of nanomechanical surrogate organs. The Hurugok helped to repair and preserve Covenant machines, and also to dismantle and reverse engineer any discovered foreigner devices. Over the centuries, the Covenant encountered many species and conscripted them into their hegemony, offering the promise of the Great Journey to all who served and believed. At the height of their empire, the Covenant included species such as the Lekgolo, commonly known as hunters, the Yanmi, which were called drones, the Kigyar, comprised of jackals and skirmishers, the Ungoi, generally referred to as grunts, and the Jiralhane, or brutes. In addition, a number of fringe species that were too small or scattered in numbers to justify full membership were still employed to various ends within the Empire. There was one species, however, whose chance discovery in the 26th century would come as great surprise to the Sanshayum. This species represented the most significant challenge to the Covenant's formerly unquestionable dominance: humanity.